cover it up. And the cover-up did not go well, so he had to have Uriah killed. And as we read chapter number 11, we would think that humanly speaking, David certainly got away with it. So we thought. Uriah never knew. Nobody knew except for David, Joab, and Bathsheba. But if you look at verse 27 of chapter number 11, the very last sentence of chapter number 11, it says, "But the thing that David had done displeased the Lord." David thought he got away with it. He thought, oh, I'm off scot-free. Nobody saw the sins that I committed, but God saw everything. And it says that the thing that he did, the thing that he had done, displeased the Lord. I say a lot of us, again, we have a tendency to categorize sins in our life, or we say, well, I can skip church now and then, or I can have this bitterness, or I can have this anger, or I can have this unforgiveness, or this unthankfulness, and nobody knows anything about it. But I will tell you again that God sees everything that we do. The eyes of the Lord go to and fro throughout the earth, and He sees the evil and the good. So we see the sin. Secondly, we see the letter B, we see the story in verses 1 through 4. Nathan tells a story to get David to understand the severity of his sin. What he was doing was saying, okay, let me give you a hypothetical situation so you can see what your sin looks like. And a lot of times, in order to really, when we have sin in our life, we must look at it objectively so we can see the severity of our sin. Imagine, how would you respond if someone else were doing the same thing that you're doing? Imagine how you would respond if a coworker had the temper that you had. What would you say about the family member who gossiped like you gossip? Or fill in the blank. When it comes to church attendance, again, I don't know why I keep hitting on church attendance, but you ask yourself the question, before you skip a service, what would you think if Brother Graham skipped the service for the same reason you were about to skip the service? Say, well, he can't skip the service. He's the pastor. Well, you're the member. I'm the member. And if it's not a good enough reason for Brother Graham to skip a service, it's probably not a good enough reason for us to skip a service. Ask yourself again, how would you react if someone close to you were involved in the same sin? This story cracks me up because I think whenever I read chapter number 3, or verse number 3, it says he treated this ewe lamb as it was his own child, and ate of his own meat, drank of his own cup, lay in his bosom. I thought, pet people are weird. You ever know? He was like the crazy cat lady, but it was a lamb. He was the crazy lamb guy. I know a lot of people like that. Whenever I show people pictures of my daughters, and they're like, oh, let me show you my pictures, and it's dogs or cats. And I'm thinking, or I'm like, do you have any grandkids? No, I've got grand dogs. Okay. They're cheaper. I will tell you that. They're cheaper. Pet people, I'm telling you. But we see the story that he gives. And the interesting thing is the sin of the rich man in this story does not at all compare to the sin of King David. All he did was took a man's lamb and had it dressed for the wayfaring traveler. King David took a man's wife and then had the man killed. Matthew chapter number 7. Matthew chapter 7, verse 3 and 4 talk about this same thing. David had this terrible sin in his life, yet he was, and we'll get to his reaction in just a moment, but he was very angry about this while ignoring a much more significant sin in his own life. Matthew chapter 7, verses 3 and 4. And why beholdest thou the mote that is in thy brother's eye, but considerest not the beam that is in thine own eye? Or how wilt thou say to thy brother, let me pull out the mote of thine eye, and behold, a beam is in thine own eye? It says, I've got this giant beam hanging out of my eye, but I'm going to tell you that, hey, you've got a splinter that you need to take care of in your eye. But a lot of times that is how we deal with sin. We've got sin in our lives, but we must look at it objectively. We must ask ourselves the question, again, how would I react if someone close to me were involved in the same sin? We see the sin, we see the story, we see the sentence, verse 5 and 6. David's anger was greatly kindled against the man. And he said to Nathan, as the Lord liveth, the man that hath done this thing shall surely die. Now David, of course, is caught up into sin. And he's not thinking clearly, because in verse number 5 he says, put that man to death. And then verse number 6 says, and then make him pay fourfold. Make him repay everything he's given. His order was not quite correct here. Maybe he should have had him pay and then kill him. And I'll tell you that whenever you're involved in sin, whenever we are overtaken with a sin, whether that, again, I'm not talking about even what we would classify as large sins, but even what we would think as less significant sins, the Bible, again, classifies all as sin, all as evil. But whenever we are involved in these types of things, our minds aren't working correctly. Just like David's wasn't. His anger was kindled. He said, kill the man. And then restore the lamb fourfold, because he did this thing and because he had no pity. I know of a pastor who was pastoring a church and had sought counsel because, without getting into the details, but had sought counsel. There was a man in his church that wanted to teach a Sunday school class. And before that man was saved, he had gotten a tattoo. And this pastor was all distraught. And I'm not preaching about tattoos today. But this man, again, had the tattoo before he was saved. And now he wants to teach a Sunday school class. And the pastor was all up in arms. Well, then, within 2 months of that conversation, the pastor was arrested for committing multiple heinous crimes that I can't even mention. And I think to myself, wait a minute. You're fretting over a decision someone made before they were even saved, when you've got this issue going on that has cost him his family, his ministry, and now he's sitting in jail today because of this exact situation. He's looking at other sins without factoring in what's going on in his own life. So we see David's condition. Secondly, we notice Nathan's confrontation. Verses 7 through 12, we see the remark. I'm not going to go through and read each of these, but Nathan, of course, he says, thou art the man. King David says, that man has committed this sin, and he needs to pay for it. He needs to die. And Nathan looks at him in the eye and says, thou art the man. This sin that you think is so terrible, I'm talking about you, David. Nathan then continues to mention all of God's blessings and provisions. In the next few verses, he says, I anointed thee. And then says, I delivered thee. And said, I gave thee. And again in verse 8, and gave thee the house. And then he even says, and if that would have been too little, I would have given you even more such and such things. He said, I have been so good to you, yet you have turned your back and done this sin against God. And then it says in verse number 10, it says, because thou hast despised me. Have you ever thought about our sin? God is perfect. God is holy. And you think about our sin and the severity of any sin that we commit, to think that we're going against the law of God, we're going against the nature of God every time we sin. And when David sinned, Nathan said, you have despised God. Now that sounds pretty serious, don't you think? So, well, I just blew my temper and it wasn't a big deal. Well, if we sin, we have despised God. Well, it was just a little white lie, or it was just a little bitterness. It was just a little unthankfulness. Or the Bible says, whatsoever is, I'm paraphrasing, but whatsoever we do that's not of faith is sin. When we really think about the sins that we commit, and the fact that we are, according to Nathan, we're despising God when we sin, kind of puts a new severity, a level of severity onto our sin. What to do when we've sinned? He was confronted, but this is what I like. We see letter B, the repentance. And David said unto Nathan, I have sinned against the Lord. He didn't make any bones about it. What happened to the previous king, Saul? Of course, he was commanded to go and destroy an entire nation, destroy everyone, and he didn't. Of course, the prophet came to him and he said, what's that I hear? The bleating of the sheep, what's going on? And what did Saul do when he was confronted with his sin? He didn't say, well, I've sinned against the Lord, forgive me. No, his response was, well, the people, they did this, and they thought it would be a good idea to keep some of the good of the flock. And he started deflecting this blame, not with David. David realized he had sinned, and he said,